For over 200 years, House Marik had held absolute power over the Freewells League. Resolution 288, passed in 2784, just weeks after the Star League Defense Force undertook their exodus, granted the Captain General complete dictatorial powers for the duration of the crisis. Kenyon Marik had played on the fear of the impending succession war to gain sufficient votes to pass this radical legislation, but no one could have imagined that the conflict would still be raging 2 centuries later. By that point in history, the Freewells League had come to be ruled by Stefan Marik, but while his family had been able to retain control, Parliament had steadily whittled away at their power. Successive heirs had been forced to compromise, and in the aftermath of the Lyran deep raid, this latest Captain General had no choice but to do the same. The provinces won themselves a larger slice of the pie when it came to dividing up the spoils of war when they passed Special Resolution 512 on September 12, 2989, better known as the Replevin Doctrine, and then greater say in the disposition of military forces via Special Resolution 523 soon after. As well as losing the support of his ministers, Stefan had also become estranged from his children. His 2 sons, Janos and Anton, had defied his wishes in their youth by choosing to enroll in Princefield Military Academy within the Grand Duchy of Oriente instead of the proper Marik Commonwealth institutions. The brothers had been thick as thieves throughout their childhood, and it was no great surprise that one would follow the other. Janos proved to be a skilled MechWarrior and graduated at the top of his class, receiving his first commission with the Freewells Guards at 21. Anton proved more rebellious and was only able to avoid expulsion thanks to his siblings' intervention, but he too proved an excellent tactician, completing his studies 2 years after his brother, later posted to the 3rd Marik Militia. Though they may have desired to stay out of politics by choosing to serve in the armed forces, they couldn't avoid seeing the ramifications of their father's dysfunctional rule. The Freewells League military was in a woeful state. Dissension had spread beyond the realm of politics. The actions of the ministers in Parliament had led to disaster on the front lines, as troops suffered from a chronic shortage of spare parts and ammunition. In 2988, an old classmate of Janos Marik had approached the young scion on behalf of a cabal within the FWLM. Sick of the government's mismanagement, they proposed an armed takeover and coup which would place Janos on the throne. Despite their strained relationship, the Marik heir remained loyal to his father and reported the incident to SAFE. Numerous individuals were imprisoned, but unfortunately the investigation never uncovered the ringleaders who went aground somewhere within the Marik Commonwealth. Nor was this an isolated incident. That same year, the defenders of Andurian Brigade launched a coup of their own, slaying Duchess Morgane Humphreys. Ultimately, the military junta fell apart before it could get off the ground, with control of the duchy passing to Morgane's niece, Dame Catherine Humphreys. The 2 Marik scions achieved the rank of colonel near simultaneously in 2989, Janos with the 1st Atrian Hussars, whereas Anton remained with his Marik militia, becoming the youngest commanding officer in their history at just 29. Regrettably, this proved an unhappy duty for them, as they were more often employed to suppress rebellion within the realm than defend its borders from hostile neighbours. Janos expressed his displeasure with frequent letters to his father, who had retreated into isolation following the failed coup, further widening the divide between them. Across the inner sphere, the Draconis Combine was in a similar state of disharmony. Perhaps the most damaging of Hohiro Kurita's dragon renewals was his attempt to tighten his control over the economy. When approached by a collective of concerned businessmen, the coordinator seized their holdings and had them beheaded for daring to defy their ruler. A mass revolt of bankers, industrialists, and merchants followed in 2989. 4 months of strikes almost bankrupted the realm, and Hohiro's effort to use the military to restore order and fill any gaps in the workforce was ineffectual. He once again was forced to concede defeat. On paper, the mustered soldiery had been the primary beneficiary of the Coordinator's unwise actions, but the near constant upheaval left every soldier deeply troubled, unable to focus on the task at hand while they worried about their families at home. The conquest of Aubusson in 2989 was their only tangible success of late, but a Lyran invasion force touched down on Severin that same year and was able to force the DCMS off-world in 2990. The military district warlords had been stripped of many of their powers, robbing the DCMS of its initiative. If there was one positive change, it was that they had been able to acquire the services of Makaran's armoured cavalry in 2991. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for them to realise the sorry state of affairs within the Draconis Combine, and they left just 5 years later. Nor were they the only mercenary regiment to leave the employ of House Kurita in the mid-2990s, citing incompetent leadership. In conclusion, the many reforms Kurita had attempted in the second half of the 30th century were all abject failures, permanently tarring the reputation of their instigator. Time was running out for Tormax Liao. Rampant military spending, however necessary, had made him unpopular with the common people, and his inability to control the populace lost him the support of the Prefectorate. The situation worsened when religious uprisings erupted on several worlds within the Capellan Confederation. Back in 2988, the Chancellor had founded the Death Commandos as a special forces unit composed of hand-picked individuals from the warrior houses. Though they sprung into action to eliminate the rebellion's leaders, riot control was outside of their purview. What remained unknown at the time was that the recent unrest was chiefly the work of Chandra Ling at the behest of Tormax's son, Maximilian Liao. They had instigated the crisis of religious fanatics as a means of discrediting the Chancellor, the first step in a plot to seize power. The Diablo, as Max had taken to styling himself, had already earned a reputation as a fierce combatant during operations against the Freewells League. In recent years, the Atrian Dragoons had twice crossed the border from within the Duchy of Andorian and wrought such terrible carnage on Aomen and Ulieri that both colonies were later abandoned. In retribution, Liao led the Red Lancers to Lopez, where they executed any Dragoon officers they could get their hands on. Using himself as bait, the noble heir waited for reinforcements to arrive so that his elite regiment could cause more damage before withdrawing. With the religious uprising becoming increasingly disruptive, Maximilian urged his father to deploy the Red Lancers to the Federated Sun's border to ensure the AFFS didn't make any opportunistic moves of their own. The CCAF had repulsed the latest Davion raid at Bell, but their own efforts at Lincoln were unsuccessful. The Capellan heir's presence at the front again drew enemy units into confrontations, each victory adding to the legend of the Diablo. Liao's chief ambition during his time away from Cyan was to meet privately with the commander of the Prefectorate Guard, Colonel Pavel Rydzik. With the support of 2 of the Capellan Hussar regiments, the scheming heir grew ever more confident. The prestigious units were recalled to the capital in 2989. After gaining assurances from the warrior house heads that they would not intervene, Max launched his coup d'etat the following spring. Nobody stood against him, save for his father's fanatically loyal Death Commandos. For 2 nights, gunshots could be heard in the dark as the last holdouts were hunted down and eliminated. Liao's first reforms came within the Capellan Confederation Armed Forces. The enormous aerospace regiments favoured by his 2 predecessors were broken up and reassigned to battle mech units. He increased the number of active colonels, something which former chancellors had kept a tight limit on specifically to avoid the chances of a military junta seizing power as they had during the time of tribulation centuries ago. Then, in 2991, he raised 4 new warrior houses: Daidachi, Fujita, Ijori, and Matsukai. This maintained the balance in power between the two halves of the Capellan military. After being ousted from power, Tormax Liao was placed in the protective custody of Pavel Rydzik. In 2992, Maximilian's father turned up dead. On an assuredly unrelated note, Pavel was elevated to the position of Strategic Military Director within the week, and given free rein to reorganize the CCAF as he saw fit. Likewise, Max's other co-conspirator, Chandra Ling, secured a place for herself when she became director of the Maskarovka, after murdering her predecessor. Seeking to take advantage of the upheaval across their Spinwood border, the defenders of Andurian launched an ambitious deep raid in 2990 across the Confederation to strike at the planet Tang in the St. Ives commonality, followed by a jab at the much closer Conquista the next year. In retaliation for their recent conquest of Kavanagh II, the wider Free Worlds League military directed an attack at the Lyran Commonwealth, invading Wing in March 2991, while the Liberation Unit on neighbouring Wyatt conducted a supporting action of their own. These would prove to be the last battles of Stefan Marik's career, as in August, the successor lord lost his fight with cancer. On September 2nd, 2991, Janos Marik became Captain General of the Free Worlds League. This promised to be a turning point in the nation's history. He immediately set about clearing house, removing nearly all of his father's bootlickers and replacing them with those he trusted. Chief among his new Council of Friends was his brother Anton, whose promotion to general at 31 was unprecedented. Other trusted military peers included the noble heir Vicente Orloff, as well as Colonel Sarge Rahal and Major Falstaff McHenry, while political advisors Stephanie Alvarez and Alan Mora rounded out his viewpoint. To help heal some of the wounds within his realm, Janos offered amnesty to all political prisoners and dispatched aid to those worlds suffering from the recent Lyran attacks. Accompanied by his wife, Hilda Lauber, he left Atreus in December and spent the next 5 months touring the realm, speaking to the other provincial heads of state and getting their perspective on the malaise that had become so pervasive. During his travels, he came to realize that the problems that had plagued the Lyran border garrisons were just as widespread along the Capellan front. Marik's first major announcement upon his return was the extravagant Millenium Celebration, a year-long sequence of festivals to take place at the turn of the century, celebrating different aspects of mankind's past 1,000 years of history. Though the nobility balked at the costs involved, the general populace was fervently behind the idea. He secured their confidence in 2993 when he swore that the Free Worlds League would not pursue any new military conquests until the needs of the people had been taken care of. In a sad turn, it was a personal tragedy that won over the last of his political opponents, Dame Catherine Humphreys. In March 2994, Hilda Lauber died unexpectedly. The Andurian Duchess had already earned a reputation as a fervent isolationist, yet even she travelled to Atreus to pay her respects and make peace with the Captain General, if only for the moment. For as much as Catherine disliked being ruled by Atreus, she hated the Capellans far more. Thus, she could never be used against her liege lord by enemies abroad. The same was not true for Dame Val Mintain of Assumption, who signed an illegal trade agreement with the Confederation. The treaty even included a secret provision to defect from the Free Worlds League altogether if the opportunity presented itself. Senior Colonel Pavel Rydzik had been a respectable, if unexemplary, regimental commander, but as strategic military director, he posed a far greater threat than the Federated Sons was used to. A raid on St. Andre in 2992 was supposed to keep the Capellans in that region on lockdown while Davion attempted to reclaim Akala. The sudden appearance of Liao aerospace fighters caused major damage to the invasion force. Though they ultimately took the world back, their next wave of attacks were called off. Now it was the CCAF's turn to hit back. In April 2993, they raided the ever-contentious Demeter, then followed it up the next year with a more alarming strike at the capital of the Capellan March, New Syrtis. Suitably chastised, the entire border went quiet for the next 3 years. CSV Pride of Blake was preparing to depart from the Sol system in late 2994 when it experienced a fusion core overload that led to disaster. Only 10 of the 82 individuals on board survived the accident. Among the casualties were 2 Prime Circuit presenters and Primus Yin Takami himself. With no designated heir, it fell once again to the surviving members of the First Circuit to elect a leader. The man they chose was Presenter Alpha Centauri Alan Rusenstein. Though a capable administrator, he was a man of no strong convictions, whose chief accolade was that he remained steadfastly apolitical in an increasingly factional ComStar. The new Primus's first official act was to appoint another 2 presenters to the vacant positions left in the wake of the JumpShip accident. His choices surprised those around him, as both replacements were rabid believers in the word of Blake. Until this point, such fanatics had been limited to the successor states for the most part. ComStar's upper echelons on Terra only paid lip service to the religious aspects of their order, understanding that it was never meant as anything more than a means of control. Alan's own views are up for debate, but he surely intended to secure a distinct power base for himself by appointing such people. The reintroduction of dogma into First Circuit proceedings only served to make such gatherings dysfunctional. Any suggestions that might be perceived to contravene Blake's will were shouted down by their latest peers. The Primus had his own agenda during this turbulent period. He believed that manipulating HPG communications to exert control over the successor states, whether by censoring information, leaking missives, or losing messages altogether, was of paramount importance. Over the last decade, the Great Houses had increasingly turned to ComStar's advocate presenters for guidance in making political decisions. Those 5 individuals had since surpassed the influence of the older Prime Circuit positions. During Rusenstein's primacy, the latter group began to fade in relevancy, either through failing to attend meetings of the First Circuit or by simply not being consulted on their opinions. Though they still officially remain on the rolls, in the modern 3025, only the 5 advocate presenters actively advise the Primus. In his short reign so far, Janos had won himself several major economic and political laudits, but precious few military ones. This was in large part by design, as he focused on restoring his exhausted troops in those early years. One of the only notable actions came at Berensen, where the CCAF successfully took control of the planet in 2995, scuppering plans by the Regulan Hazardon world to launch their own attack. The only offensive along this front came at Hall, but this was little more than a raid. On April 25, 2996, the well-respected Duke Reinhard Orloff was assassinated by Maskarovka agents as the first step to destabilize that small but troublesome duchy. By sheer happenstance, his son Skylar was on Qinghai on a diplomatic mission to try and get them to join his province, just as the Capellans launched their invasion of the system. In one day, they almost succeeded in wiping out that family branch, but the skilled Orloff Grenadiers were able to mask his presence long enough for him to escape off-world. This was not the end to Skylar's woes, however. Political pressure at Atreus exerted by Janosch's close companion Vicente Orloff allowed his cousin to supplant him in the line of succession. In a compromise deal with the more powerful dukes that surrounded him, Vicente agreed to take the title Earl to better reflect his province's standing. Meanwhile, Saif was embroiled in a thorough investigation of the FWLM bureaucracy. Janosch Marik passed the Accountability Edict in 2996 to assist them in uncovering the depths of the corruption that had led to the supply shortages along the front line. The subsequent Logistics Act led to a complete overhaul of the system, winning the Captain General further acclaim. He now looked to secure himself a more tangible victory. He soon set his sights on that ancient prize that had so far eluded every effort made by prior successor lords over the past 2 centuries to destroy it, Hesperus II. Marik knew that he did not have the forces available to attempt to capture or even damage the enormous mountain complexes. However, in some of their best work in recent times, Saif had uncovered the existence of a secret R&D base on the planet disguised as a lowly supply depot. If he could get in and steal whatever advanced technologies they were working on, or at the very least destroy the facility, it would be a great boon for the realm. Standing in his way were 5 regiments of the Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces. Crucially, however, they were commanded by a young and inexperienced officer, only recently promoted to colonel at the age of 21. From the outside, it might have looked as if this person had achieved their current rank only through nepotism, as they were a close relation to the ruling Archon, but there was more to this woman than met the eye. She was Katrina Steiner, Alessandro's niece and heir designate. Already in her short career, she had spent time within nearly every branch of the military. A BattleMech regiment was simply the latest in a quick succession of postings, but she had been training as a MechWarrior for almost a decade. There was little doubt that Katrina was on a fast track to one day become the LCAF's General of the Armies. When the Raiders appeared in system in 2997, the young colonel naturally took up a defensive position around the priceless factories, but instead, the Freewells League unit took aim at the classified Kincaid Defiance depot, quickly securing every viable landing zone in the area to prevent easy reinforcement. Steiner was forced to pivot quickly. One of the Lyran Guard regiments she commanded had a particular concentration of jump jet equipped battlemechs. These she ordered to board their dropships. When the vessels overflew the target destination, Katrina leapt from the open doors and plummeted down towards the planet below. At the very last moment, she and the rest of her unit halted their terminal descent to come down right on top of the Marik militia. The FWLM forces were stunned by these daredevil tactics and ultimately forced to retreat just shy of reaching their objective. The 10th Battle of Hesperus was thus no more successful than any prior effort. By 2997, House Steiner's interminable Operation Freedom was finally grinding to a halt after the better part of a century following the recapture of Baxter. Many lost worlds had been reclaimed, but those victories had come at great cost. No unit had the capability of advancing any further. For their part, the Kuritan commanders were also desperate for some reprieve along the Lyran front. Coordinator Hohiro Kurita's mismanagement of the realm left many officers just wanting to shelter in place. When the LCAF High Command requested that Alessandro Steiner call an end to the operation, they were flatly rebuffed by the belligerent Archon. He dreamed of greater glory still to come, and refused to ease off the pressure. Despite his wishes, those responsible for managing logistics on that front engineered numerous supply shortages that they could point to as justification for staying out of whatever Alessandro demanded next. The Archon was more preoccupied with the Marik border at this time. His niece's stunning victory on Hesperus had been a huge triumph for the Steiner family, with Alessandro dubbing Kurita as his loyal Lioness. He believed that this victory would deter any of the successor states from taking another crack at the hyper-industrial world for at least another decade, and so sought to employ the regiments typically used in its defense elsewhere. A counter-raid against the factories on Kalidasa seemed the best target. The Lioness Kurita cautioned him against leaving the planet defenseless, but he was confident that reassigning 2 battalions of the fabled Eridani Light Horse to garrison duty would be a sufficient deterrent. Instead, the young colonel was to lead the trio of Lyran guards under her command to hit back at the Freewells League later in 2997. The attack went off the rails almost immediately. The LCAF advance was halted far from their objective by the Silverhawk irregulars, and had to escape into the countryside. As the coalition reassigned more and more of their aerospace assets to the system, Steiner found herself completely cut off. Now her mission was simply to keep her troops alive. 3 regiments was too strong a force for the Silverhawks to take on and defeat, but this same size worked against Kurita as it made it almost impossible to keep all of her mechs operational and her people fed when they could only live off what they captured. The stalemate dragged on, and months turned to years. In 2998, János Marik married his second wife, Ada Stewart. Though contemporary sources are resolute that this was not simply a political union, it can't be ignored that it came with additional benefits. The main counterweights to the Marik Commonwealth in Parliament were the Grand Duchy of Oriente and the Principality of Regulus. The Stewart commonality was only the 5th power within the Freewells League, behind the Duchy of Andurian. But by uniting the 2 families, it would give them a comfortable buffer in any parliamentary votes. The price for this arrangement was that the Captain General would support Earl Andromache Stewart in his efforts to absorb 3 neighbouring systems into his sphere of influence, but this proved a political landmine that both parties ended up stepping away from. What should have been a happy year for Marik was marred by another personal tragedy when his son Cartwright died at just 12 years old. János was able to put his grief aside and see an opportunity in recent events along the Marik-Steiner border. With Kurita and her Lyran guards stuck off-world at Kalidasa, the factories they had left behind were left exposed and open to another strike. Initially, only a half-dozen light companies made landfall on Hesperus on June 21, 2998. Though the Eridani Light Horse typically excelled in quick maneuver tactics, it was 2 of their heavier battalions that had been assigned to the world. Unable to pursue them, and unwilling to leave the mountain complexes defenseless, Colonel Charles Winston ordered the 21st Strikers to hunker down and await reinforcements, much to the consternation of their LCAF liaison, Lieutenant General Wilhelm Mutheim. Unfortunately, this gave the FWLM ample opportunity to report just how depleted the garrison was, and call in their own assistance. A total of 4 battle mech regiments arrived in early September, beginning the 11th Battle of Hesperus in earnest. Mutheim ordered the ELH to advance on their landing zones, but the mercenaries steadfastly refused to follow his orders, even in the face of threats of severe recrimination. Massively outnumbered, only the quick thinking of Captain Rhianna Campbell spared them from certain defeat. Using some of her troops as bait, she lured the attackers into the narrow mountain passes. Once in position, artillery shelled the cliff faces and brought thousands of tons of rocks down on top of them. The few raiders trapped on their side of the landslide were picked apart. Though this isolated the factories from the rest of the planet and thus slowed the pace of production, it caused enough damage to make the Marik commander call off the attack. The final years of the third millennium were particularly busy ones for the Federated Sons. In 2998, they launched a total of 4 attacks against the Capellan Confederation, but not one of these succeeded in their objectives. It seemed the vaunted AFFS was losing its touch. They had slightly better fortune against the declining Draconis Combine. 2 years prior, they had successfully held off an attack at Heen, but their own raid against Royal in 2998 was a bust. They got their vengeance the following year when they tricked the DCMS into attacking a supposedly undefended Kesai, only to spring an ambush that destroyed 20 of Kurita's valuable aerospace fighters. First Prince Hasek-Davion had become seriously unwell by 2999. On his deathbed, he named his eldest son Ian as Prince Imperial, and when his father died on April 4th, the 19-year-old ascended to the throne of New Avalon. Ian Davion was cut from the same cloth as his great-grandfather Joseph. He found little joy in managing affairs of state, and was much happier leading his troops in an attack. His tenaciousness on the battlefield would earn him the moniker the Hound. His regular absence from court meant that the task of day-to-day governance fell to the March Lords of George Hasek and Benjamin Sandoval. Both were loyal to the Davion family, but Ian's refusal to heed the words of his advisors must have been trying for everyone involved. The Federated Sons began to slide backwards, just as one of their closest rivals, the Capellan Confederation, was experiencing a dramatic upswing in their fortunes. In the wake of the near-disastrous 11th Battle of Hesperus, the Iridani Lighthorse decided to let their contract with the Lyran Commonwealth expire after more than a century of faithful service. The victorious Rhianna Campbell was breveted Major and dispatched to the mercenary star Galatea to negotiate a new agreement on behalf of the ELH with one of the other successor states. The AFFS was the only one who could offer the former SLDF unit the freedom to select their own missions, from a list of Davion-approved targets, of course. Though not quite as much independence as they had hoped for, a new home within the Federated Sons was certainly preferable to remaining at their present berth and falling foul of the incompetent social generals of the LCAF. Both parties came to an agreement on October 2999. They were set to make the voyage early in the new millennium. Life within the Draconis Combine was a constant struggle under Coordinator Hohiro Kurita. People were facing 16-hour workdays, food shortages, restrictions on all foreign goods, and harsh punishments for even the slightest infraction. For all their struggle, there was one event that they could look forward to. The Millennium Day marked the end of mankind's bloodiest 1,000 years of hardship. For the first time in a long while, there was genuine hope that the succession wars would soon end, and that humanity could turn a corner. The actual celebrations were extravagant, as they were across the entire Inner Sphere, but Luthien in particular threw a carnival that was unparalleled. A greater quantity of fireworks were launched that night than on any other occasion in history. The new year marked the coming of age for the ruling house's most promising son, Takeshi Kurita. Hohiro's firstborn had been a rising star within the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery, but his progress up the military hierarchy had been stymied when his father recalled him to Luthien to serve in the Otomo, the Unity Palace Guard. This was a position of high honor, but practically speaking, it meant the odds of him seeing any real combat was virtually nil. On New Year's Day, the coordinator announced that Takeshi was to be elevated to the rank of Shosho, and given overall command of the Otomo, a position traditionally held by senior family members. The Kuritan heir was initially frustrated by the posting, but he quickly came to recognize the opportunity it gave him to learn from a safe distance about the Byzantine politics of the imperial city, knowledge he would need as heir to the Chrysanthemum throne. Furthermore, Hohiro had made him his representative within High Command, allowing him to build relationships with the military elite. Though Takashi may not have been able to participate in any battles, he could certainly help plan them. Like so many other Kuritans before him, he decided that the best way to make a splash was for the DCMS to return to that 12 times cursed planet of Hesperus. House Marik's Millennium Celebration was an extraordinary event. New Year's Eve saw planets across the Freeworlds League host extravagant parties unmatched by anything else in their history, but it was just the beginning of a year of festivities. Since coming to power, Janos had worked tirelessly to repair the damage done by his predecessors Thaddeus and Stefan. Though the Captain General's military victories were few, his economic ones were not. Despite some holdouts, he had largely succeeded in restoring Parliament's confidence in the Marik family. Over the next 12 months, Janos embarked on another tour of his realm, speaking before enormous cheering crowds. Not since Elizabeth Marik had there been such widespread support for the ruling head of state, even within the historically contentious Duchy of Andurian and Principality of Regulus. However, his newfound popularity had not been achieved without compromise. The idealism of his youth had given way to practicality upon taking office, and the provinces had won their own affirmations in the political horse trading. In keeping with the positive atmosphere brought on by the Millennium Celebration, the Freeworlds League military had refrained from launching any attacks that might result in casualties during what was supposed to be a year of peace and revelry. This did not stop the Capellan Confederation from trying to get their own back for attacks against their people at Exodore and Ingersoll the previous year. Thankfully, both raids were thrown off before they could cause any significant damage. Only on Kalidasa was there cause for alarm. Katrina Steiner had finally been able to fight her way clear of the provincial capital earlier in the year, but it was perhaps this that made the garrison lax in their vigilance. Moving through space towards them and striking at former Concordance capital Sirius in passing was a task force belonging to none other than the AFFS. Many political pundits of the day had pointed to the Federated Suns and Freeworlds League as the two nations most likely to enter into an alliance, perhaps ending the succession wars for good. This unwarranted attack dashed those hopes. An outraged Captain General dispatched emissaries to New Avalon demanding reparations, but they were attacked by the AFFS en route. In response, the FWLM orchestrated a series of retaliatory strikes over the next 6 years, disguising their efforts as Capellan raiders. Hesperus had been the site of considerable hardship for the Eridani Light Horse, but unfortunately for them, their trial was not yet over. Just a few days before their scheduled departure for the Federated Suns, 3 battlemech regiments for the Draconis Combine Mustard Soldiery launched an attack against the mountain strongholds of Defiance Industries, beginning the 12th Battle of Hesperus, the 3rd in 3 years. Elsewhere along the front, the DCMS were also attempting to take Kobe, but this was a mere sideshow compared to the main assault. Once again, the ELH, which was in no stronger position than before, defied the odds to hold out against superior numbers long enough for Lyran reinforcements to arrive, led by the Archon's cousin Raymond Steiner. It was their last battle in service to the Lyran Commonwealth. Within days, or even just hours of the LCAF's arrival, the mercenaries' contract expired, and they began to withdraw for greener pastures. Around this time, Katrina Steiner finally made it back from the meat grinder on Kalidasa, where she and her troops had been stuck for the better part of 3 years. When she learned of what had taken place in her absence, the 2 attacks on Hesperus, one of which was still raging, not to mention the loss of 3 premier mercenary regiments, she heaped scorn on the ruling Archon, as did countless others within the Lyran High Command and Estates General. Recruiting the Xian hotheads and mobile fire may have mitigated some of the loss, but it did little to improve his standing. The 12th Battle of Hesperus ended up lasting a full year, with Raymond losing his life in its final moments. The fluke success of the Deep Raid was now a distant memory that could not distract from Alessandro Steiner's more recent failings, and his competency as a ruler was increasingly called into question. When the Iridani Light Horse arrived at their new berths in April, dispersed along the Corward edge of Davion territory, they were looking forward to a dramatic upturn in their fortunes. The Federated Sons had its own problems, of course, but First Prince Ian Davion was making bold promises about a major offensive to reclaim the last of the worlds lost to the Dragon during the First Succession War. From their headquarters on Hoth, it looked as if their likely target would be either Crossing, Bene, or Glenmora, probably with an eye towards taking Harrow's Son, or even New Aberdeen if things went well. Bene was selected on account of its relatively weak garrison, and in May of the year 3000, the 7th Striker Battalion departed on their first mission for the Federated Sons. What they had not been told was that the Department of Military Intelligence strongly believed that an entire regiment of the Pesht regulars had consolidated its strength there. What was supposed to be a reconnaissance raid was actually a diversion meant to keep the DCMS occupied. McKinnon's raiders were dispatched to neighbouring Crossing to confirm the DMI's suspicions that its garrison had departed for Bene, and once the all-clear was given, the rest of the 7th Crucis Lancers moved in to secure the planet. The battered Eridani Light Horse Battalion made it back to Hoth on June 7th, but the Strikers had sustained significant damage, and their commanding officer had been killed, leaving Major Rhianna Campbell to reluctantly step into his shoes. Despite an angry tirade from her, the AFFS liaison was unperturbed. In his eyes, the ELH had succeeded in their mission, even if they hadn't known what that was when they left. It was clear then that for all their vaunted traditions and famous lineage going back to the elite of the Star League Defense Force, the Federated Sons saw their newest mercenaries as just another disposable asset. The Capellan Confederation found itself as the centre of attention in 3001, best illustrated by the raids on Way. First to strike the planet were the AFFS, but no sooner had they departed, the FWLM arrived. The existing garrison had already taken a beating, and so had to call in reinforcements. Their arrival caught the attackers off guard, and the St. Ives Lancers were even able to capture their dropships. Marik got their own back elsewhere though, when they secured the far grander prize of Berenson. On the opposite side of the realm, Liao raiders were hopping across the border to hit Axton. The 7th Crucis Lancers, hot off their victory at Glenmora, were dispatched to the obscure planet Lincoln to get revenge. They met their match when they were confronted by the fanatics of Imara and Lusan. Victory for the warrior houses came more easily than expected. Unbeknownst to them, the elite AFFS unit had not been resupplied as they passed through the Capellan March. Their weapons had run empty early in the battle. This was the first sign of the trouble that would go on to define that region of the Federated Sons up to the present day 3025. The number of people entering service with ComStar had tapered off dramatically by the turn of the millennium, Earlier in the previous century, Primus Carrie Marie Marshall had made a concerted effort to spread her order's influence out into the periphery. Though she had not met with as much success as she had hoped for, it was still a potential windfall of new recruits that her successors had not taken another look at. Alan Rusenstein was a great admirer of Marshall and decided that one of his key aims would be to expand on her earlier efforts. Over the course of his primacy, more than half of the acolytes that joined ComStar hailed from the distant periphery. He achieved this by using their news bureau to spread word of the great investments into communications infrastructure they were making. Curiously, these were always taking place on some other neighbouring world. With a complete monopoly on the spread of information, it was easy to disguise the fact that none of this was true. The Primus believed that the periphery was a threat to the rest of humanity, a sentiment shared by Jerome Blake himself, and was quite content to leave them in the dark. While this operation was a success, it did nothing to change his own worsening support on Terra. The fanatical adherence to the word of Blake, those individuals Alan had elevated to high positions as a means of winning support from the ultra-conservatives, had turned against him for some unknown slight or rejection of doctrine. They became two of his most vocal critics. When Rusenstein tried to further expand the size of the ComStar Guards and militia, the First Circuit unanimously voted against the motion. Another proposal to raise fees on HPG usage in order to shore up the faltering sea bill was similarly rejected. Whether those presenters were cutting off their nose to spite their face is up for debate. Despite a lack of cooperation between them, it was the First Circuit who became the Order's true leaders during this period. When they saw that the war between Kurita and Steiner was slowing down, the last notable action being a deep raid against Worrell in the Draconis Combine interior, they sought to reignite the conflict. The plan they devised became known as the Jolly Roger Affair. Operatives were to reach out to several disgraced MechWarriors and offer them a supply of weapons and even dropships. Each was given enough materiel to field a full battalion, making it clear to any outside observers that some third party was supplying them. The location of several lost but habitable worlds along the edge of the border, even some that still maintained small isolated colonies, were given to these bandits as well. These planets would become their bases of operation. Rom still required the approval of their Primus in order to begin such an undertaking, but Alan dared not gainsay the First Circuit. The first raids took place in Steiner territory in early 3002, with others on the Kuritan side of the border later that year. Both houses blamed the other for arming the pirates. Tension between the two realms escalated, and the war flared hot once more. Satisfied with a job well done, the First Circuit congratulated themselves on yet again outsmarting the successor states. In an effort to salvage some dignity, Rusenstein highlighted his own importance to the operation, insisting that it was his decision to assign Rom to the mission that made it such a success. The Primus declared that it was always his desire to make the Great House militaries redeploy their forces away from the more heavily populated core worlds towards the more sparsely populated fringe systems, thus saving millions of lives. He would soon come to regret trying to take all of the credit. House Kurita had long maintained that a sense of balance and harmony in all things was one of the cornerstones of Draconis Combine society. Sadly, under the current coordinator, those ideals had been sorely tested. Ironically, it was only when the controls laxed during the celebration of the new millennia that it became apparent how bad the average citizen's quality of life had become. When the successor lord tried to reimpose his authoritarian mandates in the weeks that followed, it stirred up widespread civil unrest. It was during Hohiro's reign that the long-dormant anti-Combine sentiment that existed within the Rasalhague military district began to re-emerge. The past few years had been troubled ones for the Draconis Combine. In 3001, a full regiment of the Benjamin Regulars had been wiped out trying to take back Severin. The following year, both the coordinator's youngest son Miyamoto and his nephew Akiro were killed in action. Meanwhile, Rasalhague became a hotbed of separatist troublemakers, one that the internal security force was struggling to keep a lid on. Any new military recruits coming from that region of space were thoroughly interrogated to ensure they espoused the correct pro-Kurita sentiment, but some had already slipped through the net. When cautioned about the threat they posed, perhaps even to the point that they would make an attempt on his life, Hohiro simply remarked that the circumstances surrounding my death will not matter to me, for I will be on my way to heaven. 2 years later, he'd come to regret those words. In January 3002, Anton Marik was appointed Duke of Procyon and given command of the Capellan Confederation border. The Captain General tasked him with cutting a chunk off of the neighbouring realm by advancing from Zion up towards Fletcher. He wasted no time in launching the first 2 attacks, but also started making ambitious plans for a strike on the hyper-industrial world and commonality capital Tikhonov. Janosch had his own target in mind, however, and promptly requisitioned Anton's supplies for his assault on Lorik that March, much to his brother's frustration. With his reserves pillaged, the initial invasions he had begun bogged down. Even 2 decades later, Menkalanan remains a system that neither Liao nor Marik can claim outright control over. 6 months later, a follow-up attack on the game world Solaris 7 took place. Command of the operation fell to General Willis Crawford, due in no small part to a personal recommendation from his old Princefield Academy companion Anton Marik. Safe counterintelligence had attempted to mislead the Lyrans into thinking that the attack would come from Bella, but the LIC saw through this ruse. From the outset, the combatants on Lorik and Solaris faced far greater opposition than anticipated, a problem made worse by the fact that not all of the task group made it to the system on time, delayed by a Steiner raid on Autumn Wind. The offensive had unknowingly stumbled headfirst into a recent alteration in the LCAF's deployment. The Archon's new policy of concentrated weakness had shifted many of their interior militia garrisons to the borders, and organised them into citizen regiments in much the same way his predecessor Marcus Steiner had during the Second Succession War. General Willis Crawford's decision to press ahead regardless resulted in needless casualties. The abortive campaign was abandoned come November when the FWLM lifted off Lorik as well, having been defeated by none other than Colonel Katrina Steiner. Marik would place a bounty on her head for her role in leading the Royal Guards to victory. This embarrassment had far-reaching political consequences. Provincial forces had been loaned to the Captain General in confidence, but the damage they had sustained sent the noble families into an uproar. Losing their support would inevitably mean they would turn to the Home Defense Act to withhold their troops from participating in future military operations, leaving the Freewells League at a noted disadvantage compared to the other successor states. As such, Janosch looked for a scapegoat to pin the blame on. Willis's recklessness on Solaris fit the bill, and Marik came down hard. Crawford was court-martialed and sentenced to death on June 23, 3003. 8 days later, he was shot by firing squad. His execution created a rift between the two brothers that would never heal. Anton believed that his friend had been thrown to the wolves to placate the bickering politicians. No other Free Worlds officer had suffered such a fate in over a century, despite the fact that the League was not short of military defeats during that period. Nor did the Duke of Procyon's anger at the decision go unnoticed by the enemies of House Marik. First to approach him was the enemy within, survivors from the group that had sought to supplant their father back in 2988. Though Anton did not agree to participate in the coup, it was telling that he did not report the conspiracy to SAFE either. The Federated Sun's Ministry of Information, Intelligence and Operations was also able to infiltrate the Duke's staff, a position from which they could encourage further dissension between the two brothers, undermining one of their succession war rivals. First Prince Hasek-Davion was leading the charge against the Draconis Combine in the early years of the 31st century. He touched down on Harrow's Sun in late June 3002, and in just 2 weeks secured a stunning victory over some of the Draconis Combine's best troops. That December, the AFFS seized control of the Silene system as well. DCMS counterattacks against Deshla and Alidera were beaten off in similarly convincing fashion. Unbeknownst to the First Prince and his officers, their victories along the Kuritan front contrasted heavily with the situation in the Capellan March. There, the armed forces of the Federated Suns were lucky if they got even half of the supplies they had requisitioned. Discontent was building within the ranks. Many felt they had been abandoned by Ian. While the First Prince was winning great victories at Harrow's Sun and Silene, the invasion of New Hessen ended in failure, whereas the liberation of Camel only succeeded at a heavy cost to the Avalon Hussars. Worse, the Capellan Confederation was able to win back control of Texlos. In 3003, Warrior House Ajori launched a daring raid against the interior world of Sama, where the mercenary garrison was forced to surrender after exhausting their meager ammunition stockpile. The reason for this supply snafu can be traced back to one individual, Michael Hasek, son of the Duke of New Syrtis. Over the past few years, he had been diverting funds to win favour within the nobility, all the while secretly fomenting anti-Davion unrest within his father's territory. The planets Andro, Camel and Qingtao all suffered an outbreak of rebellion that required troops to be redeployed to restore order, events which he encouraged his media friends to criticize. By 3003, his influence at court had surpassed both of the March Lords. With his power base established, on August 3rd he married Marie Davion St. Clair, illegitimate daughter of the former First Prince, an elder half-sister of Ian. Henceforth, Michael signed his name Hasek-Davion. His adoption into the ruling family opened many doors for him at court that previously were closed. Though Marie had been excluded from the line of succession, if things continued as they were, the nobility might overturn that ruling. Michael had cleverly positioned himself as a viable alternative to the absentee Ian. Almost without exception, the Periphery had been able to avoid being drawn into the succession wars. Certainly they had suffered tremendously from the economic fallout that followed the collapse of the Star League, and were a mere shadow of their former selves. But they had nonetheless made some minor recovery in more recent years. Most notably, the industrial output of the Taurian Concordat had now surpassed what they had been capable of as a territorial state, minus the shipyards which had vanished from pretty much all of human space. It was sadly this which drew the attention of House Liao. In 3002, they launched one of the exceedingly rare Periphery raids aimed at Penard, where they took an entire mercenary company prisoner. As if to rub salt in the wound, they returned again the following year to steal more of the planet's valuables. The fallout between the two Marik siblings had not gone unnoticed within the Capellan Confederation. While the Chancellor mulled over how best to exploit this situation, the CCAF launched a raid against Nam Dinh in 3003. Soon afterwards, Maximilian Liao dispatched emissaries to meet with a frustrated younger brother. A ceasefire along their border would be mutually beneficial, giving the Confederation time to heal and Anton a political victory to tout in Parliament. To strengthen the partnership, the successor lord offered his eldest daughter Candace's hand in marriage. Such a union had the potential to transform the face of the Inner Sphere. There was even talk of assassinating Janosch if the opportunity presented itself, though the younger Marik seemingly turned this down. Max was also embroiled in a scheme to readjust the power structure within his armed forces. His father's death commandos, now reconditioned to be fanatically loyal to the man who had annihilated them during the night of the coup, had originally only been open to the creme de la creme of warrior house candidates, but that year it was broadened to include applicants from the regular forces. To placate those traditionalists within the pseudo-religious orders who saw themselves as above the common masses of the CCAF, he agreed to remove them from under the command of Strategic Military Director Pavel Rydzik, though the Death Commandos would continue to serve as his senior colonel saw fit. On the night of February 3rd, 3004, Talon Sergeant Ingmar Sterensen was making his way through the palace gardens on Luthien. As a member of the Otomo, he knew exactly where every security device and watchpost was located, allowing him to navigate around them. As he skulked towards the coordinator's bedchambers, two of his fellow guards were alerted by the sound of footsteps. When they confronted Ingmar, he cut them both down and burst into Hohero's room. Lifting his sword, Sterensen cried out, "Freedom for the people of Razelhague," then brought down the katana with such force it embedded itself in Kurita's skull. The Talon Sergeant did not make it far before more of the Otomo cornered him in the tea house. Shortly after, Takashi Kurita himself arrived, along with his 6-year-old son roused from his sleep by the commotion outside. The Razelhague National repeated his call for independence, before the new coordinator ordered him shot dead on the spot. His body was hung from a tree until his bones fell to the ground. Takashi immediately proved his wisdom by repealing many of the most oppressive and tyrannical edicts his father had enforced. This won him instant acclaim among the common masses. However, not all was well at court. Several people had begun to whisper that he had used his position as commander of the Otomo to assist Ingmar Sterensen in reaching Hohero, and that his decision to execute the traitor before he could be questioned by the ISF was an attempt to cover up his patricidal plot. When Kurita was informed of such, he had anyone who had dared to slander his name summarily executed. He also took the opportunity to rid himself of several political opponents and hangers-on from his father's reign. Their unfortunate families would also become victims of Takashi's purge. The coordinator may not have been as strict as his sire, but he could be as ruthless as any prior Kurita if the situation called for it. The divide between Alessandro Steiner and the Lyran High Command had only widened since the Archon instituted his controversial doctrine of concentrated weakness. Though moving vast amounts of manpower to the border systems had won them absolute victories against the recent Freewells League aggression, many of those planets devoid of their militia had seen widespread rioting or even outright anarchy, particularly those bordering the Periphery. One contemporary famously derided the policy as concentrated foolishness. The situation had calmed somewhat since then, but there was a real fear that once their enemies realized where their troops were deployed, they might try to jump past the fortified front line and strike at the vulnerable interior worlds. 3003 saw further trouble for the Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces, particularly their aerospace branch. A failed raid against Bella resulted in the destruction of several valuable craft, and then another squadron was wiped out on Thorin before they could even launch to intercept the inbound Kuritans. In February 3004, the LCAF made another attempt to damage the priceless factories on Kaladasa. The Silverhawk Irregulars once again proved their worth by first defeating the Arcturan Guards, then a battalion of the Sky Rangers when they arrived as reinforcements on March 1st. One of the Archon's most vocal critics was his niece, Lieutenant General Katrina Steiner. In 3004, she was reassigned to the Strategy and Tactics Division. Many of her peers saw the air designate as the only hope of getting through to her obstinate uncle. She was seemingly the one person within the LCAF whom the Archon respected, even if their relationship had become fractured by Alessandro's repeated military blunders. Regrettably, Katrina had only 1 year in the role before fate intervened to steer the Commonwealth in a wholly different direction. In 3004, two of the roving bandit groups created during the Jolly Roger affair unexpectedly allied with one another, combining their forces into a full regiment of battle mechs. This made them one of the most powerful groups within the Periphery, allowing them to strike deeper into the inner sphere and at more valuable objectives. This was not welcome news for the First Circuit, who dispatched an envoy to treat with Darlene Dunson and dissuade her from further action. The meeting did not go well, and the ComStar forces had to fight their way to safety, killing Darlene in the effort. This infuriated her lover Jack McGurk, who swore bloody vengeance against the Order. The hyperpulse generator stations on Canal and Lost were utterly destroyed by his ragtag forces, their occupants put to the sword. It fell to the ComStar guards and militia to bring the pirates to justice. They arrived at Blackjack's hidden outpost within the unmarked Trisha system and immediately engaged the bandits in combat. They fought tenaciously against their former benefactors, and despite 1st Division's 3-1 numerical advantage, McGurk and his followers inflicted more than 75% casualties before the last of them fell. Though the losses were terrible, the guards and militia had again proven itself a vital tool in ComStar's arsenal, one that had expanded in secret to a full 50 regiments by year's end. The First Circuit, meanwhile, were looking for someone to blame for the unforeseen ramifications of arming such unscrupulous individuals with vast stockpiles of weapons. Alan Rusenstein's prior efforts to take credit for the Jolly Roger affair made him a convenient scapegoat. Further compounding the issue was the recent upturn in Freewell's League economic might thanks to Janosch's reforms. For the first time since the old ComStar letter of credit was replaced in 2835, the value of the Marik Eagle surpassed that of the Sea Bill. Support for the Primus fell to unprecedented lows. Some even considered calling for a vote of no confidence. It was against this backdrop that a terrifying new threat suddenly appeared along the fringes of the Periphery, one that would forever change the face of the Inner Sphere. Remember those days when I said that I could probably cover the first 150 years of the Third Succession War in maybe a 90-minute video because nothing happens? Yet here we are now, taking more than an hour to cover just a 15-year time span. When I finished the last chapter, I thought I was more or less ready to get straight back into work on this one. All I had to do was add in a few supplemental sources on top of the old house books I'd used to write the first draft, and then I'd be ready to go. I thought it might be a little bit longer than the last few we've done. but I could comfortably cover the rise of all 5 of the current crop of successor lords in just one video, easily coming in under an hour. And yet with each passing day, I found myself tumbling ever further down the rabbit hole, and this chapter grew into an absolute monster. It was well over 15,000 words by the time I decided to split it into 2, which is already making each half significantly longer than the 6,000 to 6,500 average I've been maintaining throughout most of the rest of this series. If you have made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm hopeful, now that I'm finally done with these bloody scripts, that the next one will be coming out in short order and there won't be another 1 month break between them. The plan is certainly to get it finished before Christmas. It's probably going to be another 1 hour plus video, focusing on the rise of the last 2 successor lords that are current, circa 3025, but also the emergence of Wolf's Dragoons. And that'll cover the 10-year period up to the beginning of Anton's Revolt. Speaking of, one of the things I really wanted to stress in this chapter was just how good of a Captain General Janos Marik was for the Free Worlds League. The first decade of his time in office sees a complete reversal in fortunes. And yes, many of his more ambitious military maneuvers do end in failure, but he was still perceived as a very strong and positive figure within the realm. The reason I wanted to bring such attention to that is because of the 5 successor lords that we will see in the next chapter, he becomes the bit of the lame duck and doesn't get hardly any respect by the time we get to 3025. Now, obviously, there are events that transpire between now and then that will change his place in history, how he is remembered. But it's not fair to ignore just how important he was to starting the process of the Free Worlds League's recovery, even if things did stall out quite badly for a couple decades. The Free Worlds League wasn't the only realm in recovery at this point. The Capellan Confederation, helmed by Maximilian Liao, is also seeing a dramatic upswing in their fortunes. The Chancellor is certainly one of the most villainous characters within the setting, yet he's another one who's looked down on or remembered as nothing more than a fool because of events that take place later on in the timeline. Once more, I felt it important to stress just how much of a positive impact he had on the Capellan Confederation, in his early years at least. Last of the 3 new successor lords was Takashi Kurita. Now, he hasn't yet done very much of significance up to this point in the timeline, but suddenly over the next 20 years, you will see him transform the Draconis Combine just as his peers had done in the Free Worlds League and Capellan Confederation, and make major and significant changes that will once more make it a powerhouse within the Succession Wars. But that's not where the comparison ends, of course, because Takashi Kurita, just like those other 2, events transpire a bit later on that will permanently tar the way that he's kind of remembered. There is one other future successor lord who made their first appearance in this chapter, but we'll leave it until next time to discuss them in more detail. ComStar 2 is going through one of the lowest points in its history. It's really only because there's no one left in the successor states who perceive them as a significant threat that they're able to get by, because they've lost that clarity of purpose they had under the leadership of some of their previous primuses. And it's debatable whether they ever get it back for the rest of their existence. But to talk about that really is getting ahead of ourselves, so we'll call it a day here. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you have enjoyed the video. If you did, you can leave me a comment below letting me know what you liked. Or if you've got any questions, feel free to ask them. I do try to respond to as many comments as I can. You can support the channel by giving the video a like, or sharing it around with other people in the community who you think might be interested in it. There is a link to my Patreon in the video description as well. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one. I'm confident that there will be one more coming out before Christmas. And then, in the new year, it's time to cover the main event, so to speak, Anton's Revolt. So thank you once again for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this extra long video, and I will see you soon for another one.